On May 1st, 2026, President Trump sent a letter to Congress that just triggered a constitutional countdown most Americans don't know exists. The letter said hostilities with Iran have terminated, not paused, not de-escalated, terminated. And with that single declaration, Trump started a 60-day clock that could either give him unlimited war powers or force the largest military withdrawal since Vietnam. Because under the War Powers Resolution of 1917-3, once you notify Congress that you've put troops in harm's way, they have 60 days to vote yes or no. If they vote no, you withdraw. If they do nothing, you still withdraw. But Trump just said the clock doesn't apply anymore because hostilities ended. Congress says that's not how the law works, and now we're in a legal standoff that affects defense contracts worth billions, oil prices, and whether a president can wage war without asking permission. Welcome to the channel where we follow the money behind the headlines. If you want to understand how a constitutional crisis turns into a budget crisis and a market crisis, stay with me and subscribe, because what happens in the next 59 days will set the rules for every war after this one. So what did the letter actually say? According to The Guardian's reporting on May 1st, Trump's notification to Speaker Mike Johnson stated that US armed forces engaged Iranian military targets throughout April, but that hostilities involving US armed forces have now terminated. The letter listed airstrikes on Iranian drone facilities, naval engagements in the Strait of Hormuz, and support operations for Israeli defense systems. Then came the key line: because hostilities have terminated, the 60-day authorization period under the War Powers Resolution does not apply. That interpretation contradicts how every legal scholar and congressional staffer reads the statute. The War Powers Resolution says the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of introducing forces into hostilities. Once notified, Congress has 60 days to authorize continued operations. If Congress doesn't act, forces must withdraw. The law doesn't say the clock stops if the president declares victory. It says the clock starts when forces enter hostilities, and it keeps running until Congress votes or 60 days pass. According to PBS reporting on the same day, constitutional law experts from both parties agree Trump's interpretation has no legal foundation. But Trump isn't backing down. In a Truth Social post hours after the letter, he wrote, "Hostilities are over. We won. Iran knows it. The 60-day rule is for active wars, not cleanup operations. Congress can vote if they want, but they don't have to. That's the crisis." Because if the president can declare hostilities over whenever he wants, the War Powers Resolution becomes meaningless. You might be thinking, why doesn't Congress just vote and settle this? Because the vote is politically toxic no matter which way it goes. If Congress votes to authorize force, every member goes on record supporting a war that polling shows 61% of Americans oppose. That's campaign ad material for challengers. If Congress votes to deny authorization, they look weak on national security and hand Trump a talking point. Congress wanted to surrender to Iran, and here's the bigger problem: nobody knows if they have the votes either way. According to The Hindu's coverage of congressional reactions, on May 1st, House Republicans are split three ways. One faction supports Trump's position that the war is over and no vote is needed. Another wants to authorize force to show strength, but knows it might not pass. A third group wants to deny authorization to reassert congressional war powers, but fears political backlash. Democrats are equally divided. Progressives want to force withdrawal, moderates want authorization with strict limits. Defense hawks want a clean authorization with no restrictions. Speaker Johnson hasn't scheduled a vote. The Senate Majority Leader hasn't committed to floor time, and every day that passes without a vote is another day closer to the deadline. That's not gridlock. That's a strategic stalemate where nobody wants to move first. While Congress debates procedure, markets are pricing in risk. Defense contractors with exposure to Middle East operations face revenue uncertainty. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics all have contracts tied to sustained presence in the region. Munitions resupply, maintenance deals, logistics support contracts all depend on clear legal authority for operations. If the War Powers deadline expires without authorization and Trump withdraws forces, those contracts pause or terminate. If Trump ignores the deadline and continues operations without authorization, the legal status of new contract obligations becomes murky. Either way, uncertainty costs money. Stock prices for major defense firms dropped between 2 to 4% in trading on May 1st following Trump's letter, according to market data. That's not panic selling, but it's a clear signal that investors are repricing risk. Oil markets reacted differently. Brent crude fell $3.2 per barrel on May 1st, closing at $89. Traders interpreted Trump's hostilities terminated claim as reducing the immediate risk of conflict in the Strait of Hormuz. But risk premiums for tankers transiting the Gulf didn't fall proportionally, because insurers price legal ambiguity as a cost. If US military presence in the region is legally questionable, the security guarantee for shipping is also questionable. That keeps insurance costs elevated even if immediate conflict risk falls. There's also a budget execution problem. The Pentagon has been funding operations against Iranian targets using existing appropriations. According to defense budget rules, that's legal for short-term emergencies, but sustained operations require either baseline funding or supplemental appropriations. If Congress won't vote on a supplemental because the war's legal status is disputed, the Pentagon has to shift money from other accounts. That delays shipbuilding contracts, aircraft procurement, and modernization programs. Those delays hit revenue recognition for contractors and ripple through supply chains. Now let's talk about the actors who benefit when the US is locked in a constitutional standoff. Iran wins time. If Trump can't get congressional backing and can't legally sustain operations past 660 days, Tehran knows the threat of US military action has a deadline. That changes their calculation for every decision, restarting enrichment, harassing shipping, supporting proxy forces. According to The Guardian's analysis, Iranian officials are publicly calling the war powers dispute proof that the American system cannot sustain its aggression. That's propaganda, but it's effective propaganda because it's partially true. Russia wins distraction. Every carrier group in the Persian Gulf is one not available for deterrence in Europe. Every dollar spent on Iran operations is a dollar not spent on Ukraine support or NATO readiness. Moscow doesn't have to do anything. The constitutional crisis does the work. And there's a direct economic benefit for Russia. Oil prices staying elevated due to Middle East uncertainty help Russia's budget. According to market analysis, every $10 increase in crude prices adds roughly $20 billion annually to Russian export revenue. The war powers crisis keeps prices higher than they'd otherwise be, which funds Russian military spending. China wins operational space. Beijing's primary concern is us focused on the Western Pacific. If Washington and Congress are gridlocked over Iran, Pentagon bandwidth for Indo-Pacific planning shrinks. China doesn't gain territory from this, but it gains time to consolidate positions in the South China Sea without facing coordinated pushback. Defense contractors face mixed outcomes. Sustained operations mean revenue, but legal ambiguity makes planning impossible. If the war powers fight leads to sudden withdrawal or funding freezes, contractors face revenue gaps that show up in quarterly earnings. But the biggest consequence isn't short-term, it's structural. If Trump's interpretation stands, the war powers resolution becomes unenforceable. Every future president will use the same playbook, introduce forces, notify Congress, then declare hostilities terminated before the 60-day clock expires. That might sound like a win for executive flexibility, but it creates a different problem: unchecked war spending. The War Powers Resolution was passed in 1973 specifically to prevent presidents from waging open-ended wars without congressional buy-in. It came out of Vietnam, where escalation happened incrementally without clear authorization votes. The law was designed to force accountability. If that check disappears, wars get easier to start and harder to end. From a budget perspective, that means higher baseline defense spending. According to Congressional Budget Office models, every sustained carrier strike group deployment costs approximately $1.2 billion annually in operating expenses alone, not counting munitions or maintenance. If presidents can sustain deployments indefinitely without congressional authorization, those costs never face proper scrutiny. They get buried in supplemental appropriations or shifted between accounts. That makes long-term fiscal planning harder and hides the true cost of military commitments. There's also a constitutional balance issue. The founders split war powers between Congress and the president deliberately. Congress gets the power to declare war and fund it. The president gets the power to command forces. That split was designed to prevent exactly this scenario: one person deciding both to wage war and to fund it indefinitely. If the war powers resolution fails, that balance tilts entirely toward the executive. And once it tilts, it's very hard to rebalance. So what happens now? Three scenarios are possible, and each has different economic and strategic implications. Scenario 1, Congress votes to authorize. This gives Trump clear legal authority and removes uncertainty. Defense contractors get revenue visibility. Oil markets price out some risk premium. But every member of Congress goes on record supporting a war, which creates political exposure. Probability based on current reporting, 30%. Scenario 2, Congress votes to deny authorization. This forces a constitutional confrontation. If Trump complies and withdraws forces, it's the first time the War Powers Resolution has actually forced a president to end operations. That sets a powerful precedent for congressional war powers. But if Trump ignores the vote and continues operations anyway, the crisis escalates into a separation of powers fight that could end up in federal court. Probability, 20%. Scenario 3, Congress does nothing. The 60-day deadline expires with no vote. This is the path of least resistance politically, because it avoids a tough vote. But it leaves the legal status of us forces in limbo. If Trump withdraws to comply with the law, he looks constrained. If he continues operations without authorization, Congress loses leverage. Probability based on current political dynamics, 50%. The most likely outcome is scenario 3, because it's the only one that doesn't force members to take a position. But it's also the worst outcome for markets, contractors, and allies, because it maximizes uncertainty. If you want to track this like an analyst, not a commentator, watch these indicators. First, watch whether Speaker Johnson schedules a floor vote. If he does, it means he thinks he has the votes or wants to force a political confrontation. If he doesn't, it means leadership is betting on delay. Second, watch Defense Department budget execution reports. If the Pentagon starts shifting funds between accounts or requesting emergency transfer authority, it signals they're preparing for a scenario where supplemental funding doesn't come through. Third, watch contractor earnings calls. TFOs will get asked about revenue visibility tied to Middle East operations. Their answers will tell you whether they think this is a short-term disruption or a sustained legal fight. Fourth, watch court dockets. If a member of Congress or veterans group files suit to enforce the War Powers Resolution, it changes the timeline. A lawsuit forces judicial interpretation, which could take months, but would create binding precedent. Fifth, watch oil markets. If risk premiums for Gulf shipping fall, it means traders believe the ambiguity is resolving. If premiums stay elevated or rise, markets are pricing in sustained uncertainty or renewed conflict risk. Here's the bottom line. Trump declared hostilities terminated, but the War Powers Resolution doesn't care about declarations. It cares about timelines and votes. Congress now has 59 days to authorize, deny, or do nothing. Each option has costs. Authorization legitimizes the war but creates political exposure. Denial creates a constitutional confrontation. Doing nothing maximizes uncertainty and weakens congressional war powers permanently. Meanwhile, markets are repricing risk. Defense contractors face revenue uncertainty. Oil prices stay elevated. Adversaries gain time and operational space. And the constitutional balance that's supposed to prevent open-ended wars is being tested in real time. This isn't just a legal fight, it's a budget fight, a market signal, and a precedent that will shape war powers for decades. So, what do you think Congress should do? Authorize, deny, or delay? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want to follow how this unfolds over the next 59 days, subscribe to. We'll track the budget signals, contractor moves, and market reactions as this constitutional crisis plays out. Share this with anyone who thinks constitutional disputes don't have economic consequences, because this one does. I'll see you in the next video, where we break down what happens if the 60-day deadline expires with no vote.